Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Chasing Lullabies. Just a quick show of hands. Can you hear me okay on this computer? Fantastic. Okay, if you anything the internet knocks out, then just give a shout and give a wave, and I'll go back over that point. So, welcome back to Chasing Lullabies, the program, the series, the workshop that tries to engage in a more adult level with the stories that we have become so used to that sometimes we cease to ask questions about. But it seems to me that the question that has, or the parsha that we have just come out of, and sometimes it's quite nice to have these sessions as a follow-on from reading the parsha on the weekend, because we get to read the parsha and get really bothered by it and get really frustrated and ask all those questions that we want to ask, and then we come together afterwards with a little bit more maybe some passion and some interest in that question, or greater interest in that question. So the question that I like, the episode that I'd like to open up with us this evening, and it will continue what we learned last week about Rebecca's role, is to think about the role of Rebecca in this week's Torah portion, because this week we have the very famous seeming trickery of Rebecca's husband, Isaac. Isaac is blind, and he has decided that the time has come to bless his son. And we know that he wants to give the blessings to his favored son, Esau. Whereas Rebecca seems to have a different plan in mind and instead wants to give the blessings to Jacob. And what follows is some sort of significant act of deception whereby the smooth-skinned Jacob is dressed up in the coat of Esau, that the game meal that Esau was meant to go out, catch and prepare now becomes a master chef delight of Rebecca herself, as she instructs Jacob to go out to take one of the goats from the paddock. She will then prepare it according to the way that her husband Isaac likes it. And then in goes Jacob into the room, and as we know, the rest follows on. That he says at that fateful turn of events when his father says, "Who are you? Who are you? Miata bani, who are you, my son?" And he says, "I am I am Esau, your firstborn." And he lies. And he lies. And then Esau gets very angry, and he gets murderously angry, and Jacob runs away from his father's home, actually never really able to come back again until many, many years later, because Esau's anger does not seem to abate until such time as we have the reconciliation in a later Torah portion. But this week, thinking specifically about Rebecca's role in all of this, what questions do you have about Rebecca, or to Rebecca? Imagine, for example, that Rebecca is right here. She's actually our guest this evening. Welcome, guys. Our guest this evening is Rebecca, the matriarch. We put it out on US TV. A few people sort of decided to log in. But here we are. Our guest tonight is Rebecca, the matriarch. Hello, Rebecca. It's nice to see you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I know you've got a very busy schedule of speaking engagements, but so nice to have you. Barnet Synagogue is a wonderful place. So thank you for joining us. So here she is, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, Rebecca is here tonight to answer your questions about the episode of deceiving her husband, Isaac. What questions do you have for her, ladies and gentlemen?
How could you do such a deceitful thing to your husband and command Jacob to undertake what he did do?
Right. So on tonight's episode of Jerry Springer, where we interrogate Rebecca the matriarch about her relationship, her marital relation, her marriage, we say, "What are you doing to your husband? How could you do such a thing to your husband?" Jonathan, what marriage advice would you have given Rebecca in this situation if she wanted to give the blessings to Jacob?
Well, you could say don't do anything at all, because just thinking about when the two babies were in her womb, she had this prophecy that the younger one would rule the older one. That, well, just leave it up to God to sort it out.
Ooh, okay. Leave it up to God. But even if you're not quite ready yet to just entirely take a back seat, um, what might you have communicated? What might you? I'm sorry, already. Rebecca, what else could you have done other than either entirely deceiving your husband or just taking an entire back seat? What else could you have done?
Tell Isaac about the prophecy if you should.
Oh, okay, fine. Have a conversation with your husband. That's right. Yeah, you don't have to be a clinical psychologist to know the relationship advice 101 is talk to each other. Why didn't you just talk to each other? If you had this prophecy, Rebecca, and Jonathan's right. Rebecca had this prophecy when the twins were in her womb that the younger one will rule over the old one. She has this understanding that the younger one is going to be a good guy. Why don't you talk to your husband about it? What's the elaborate plot about? Just talk. And yeah, any other questions for Rebecca this evening, audience? She's only here for a little bit, so we have to get those questions in.
Why did you, Rebecca, favour Jacob as opposed to Esau? Couldn't you love both your children the same?
Why did you favour Jacob over Esau? Couldn't you love both children the same? Amazing question. So, well, I'm gonna throw that one back at you, Stephen. So, if you love both children the same, does that mean that both children? Well, what do you do when there's only one thing to give to one child?
Oh, I wouldn't put them in that. So I wouldn't get myself in that situation.
That's sticky, isn't it? That's really tricky. That's a tricky one.
Split it. I have to split it.
You have to split it. So it's interesting
when Danielle was young, we used to line her up against the wall and say, "Come, walk to the one that you like the most." That used to confuse that.
It was interesting because there is a law in Judaism that that the firstborn gets double the inheritance of the other children, right? So my parents are actually on this this Zoom call, and I have been telling them this for a while that they need to write that into their will, but it doesn't seem to be working in any way. But it does seem like somehow in Judaism we do seem to give the rights of primogeniture, the rights of being the firstborn, come with payment. Why do they come with payment? Because look, if you're a firstborn son, you have to actually do something with that. You're the first one. You're the one they make all the mistakes with, but you're also the one who has to set an example for the other siblings. And we're only talking about the firstborn getting double if there are other siblings. Otherwise, the firstborn gets everything. So you have to set an example for the other siblings. By the way, my parents will now be saying, yeah, but you didn't set your example, so we're not going to give you double. But that's a separate point, and we're saying far too much about the Landau family already. But it's just a joke, Mum. It's just a joke. Anyway, but what the point is that your primogeniture is meant to give you something. You had a responsibility as the firstborn child, and so therefore you should also get double. So there is seemingly, Stephen, a hard edge here that who is the firstborn? Who is the right firstborn? Because we know also this Esau is not given much clout to the firstborn because he was willing to sell it, the firstborn rights. He was willing to sell it for a bowl of lentils. So there's something over here.
Is Rebecca still with you, Rabbi?
Pardon?
Is Rebecca still with you?
No, she's here. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was talking over her. I was talking over her. Unbelievable.
I was distracted. I'm sorry. Why didn't you do more to get Esau to walk the path of better life?
Oh, very good. Very good. Okay. Very good. Okay. So I think there's two main questions that we have for Rebecca. Thank you for joining us in the studio this evening. That happens to be my office. It's very nice. So the first question we have for you, Rebecca, is why not just talk to your husband, tell him about the prophecy? If God speaks to you, that's a big deal. Share that experience with your husband. Question number 2, Rebecca, is what happened to your love for Esau? I mean, he's your son after all. He's your son. He's your twin, the twin of Jacob. Why didn't you have more care and affection for him? Okay. So the question that I really want to deal with tonight, is the first one about why they didn't talk. The question that I want to address, but address very briefly because it's a theory, it's not a certainty, is just a quick conversation with Rebecca about this question about Esau and love for Esau. Because it's important to address, but I don't want to dwell on it necessarily. So sort of just bringing that one question to the fore, but then to move on from it. And this is just a theory that I developed actually with a friend of mine in the Kollel where I was learning in Jerusalem, because we were both bothered by this question. What about her love for Esau? So Rebecca, I'm going to do this conversation. Rebecca, that Esau has some positive qualities and he has definitely some negative qualities. And a mother knows their son, right? So a mother knows their son's best bits and a mother knows their son's worst bits. So I'm so acutely aware that my mom's listening to this, but my mother knows her son's best bits and her son's worst bits. So that what's Esau's best bit? There's a part of Esau that is unashamedly is put out there by the sages as being something that he excelled in. Does anyone recall what the sages say about what Esau excelled in?
Cooking.
No?
Cooking.
Jonathan?
Cooking.
What was that, Mum? Right, coming up. Thanks, Dad. So my father's jumped in there. So he says that the honouring of one's, that's funny. Well, the honouring of one's father is exactly what Esau excelled in. There was no one who honoured their parent quite like Esau did. He was so connected to his father, and he had his head in the right place. How do we know he had his head in the right place? Because our sages tell us that his head is buried in the cave of the patriarchs. His head is buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, in the cave of the patriarchs, because his head was in the right place. His head understood that Isaac was the person who he had to show honor to and accord all that respect to. And that's what he did. He accorded all that honor, all that respect. So
yeah, but
mother knows this. Yeah.
Did he not? But he took his wives from the local population, which it says that both Yitzhak and Rivka were both very angry about. So it couldn't. So there was a breakdown in Kibbutz for that, wasn't there?
Well, yes and no. So there's two things there, Joe. One thing is that you could argue that the person you choose to marry is your choice. It's not necessarily based upon how you honor someone. You don't honor someone by the person you marry. That will possibly lead to a poor marriage. If you honor if you're seeking to only honor your parents by choosing the person you marry. But there's a separate point, which is that in this week's parasha we see that as he realizes his mistake and as he realizes how he's hurt his parents, so he goes and gets a third wife. Who's the third wife he gets? He gets a wife who is the granddaughter of Abraham, who through Hagar, through Keturah. So he gets a wife who is ultimately from the Abrahamic family, because he recognizes he's made a mistake there. So I think he tries to solve this because why? Because he's seen Jacob. Jacob has gone down to Padan Aram to get a wife from Abraham, the Abrahamic family. So too he's decided to get a wife from the Abrahamic family. So now going back, mother Rivka, you know that your son, he's person who's got so close to his father. He holds his father up to be the greatest person possible. So you've got two options here, Rebecca, how you're going to deal with Esau. You could either deal with Esau by turning the father against the son, by letting the father know about the prophecy. But or you could turn the son against the son by not letting the father know about the prophecy. And then it's as if the father hasn't rejected the son. It's rather the brother has tricked the brother. You have two options here how to manage the situation. You know, Rebecca, that ultimately the act of goodness is on the path of goodness is for Jacob to be the next patriarch, for Jacob to get all the blessings. You've seen the quality of Jacob. You've seen the difficulties of Esau. You know, actually, even though he's very good with his father, he's very poor in other areas. Like Joe said, ultimately he did marry out. Ultimately he is worshipping idols. Ultimately he's going around killing people and stealing things. He's not great in other areas. So you've seen that there are lots of difficult things here, which mean that he can't be the firstborn in all those blessings. But you know that his redeeming factor is that he has a good relationship with his father. How are you going to take the blessings away from Esau? There's two options. Either you turn the father against the son, or you turn the brother against the brother. What's going to be more damaging to Esau? If you turn the father against the son. So your only option is to turn brother against brother. That's less damaging to Esau than it would be if I was to turn the father against the son. Therefore, I don't say anything to my husband. Maybe I concoct an elaborate scheme. All in the protection of Esau. So that ultimately, even though the blessings are taken away from him, he will only hate Jacob, but he won't hate his father. His last connection to Judaism won't be broken. That's a theory. I like the theory. But pop it in your pipes and smoke it. But we're going to move on from this point. And we're actually going to think about these things in a slightly different way now. We're going to say that actually it wasn't a scheme. We're going to try and work out that maybe Rebecca didn't intend to deceive her husband at all. Maybe Rebecca's going to come back to you, Jonathan, to your question, and Rebecca's going to say, I always wanted for there to be a communication here. I always wanted for there to be a communication. Do you know what I wanted to happen? I wanted my son Jacob to speak up to his father and prove his worth. I wanted Jacob to be the doer. But before we get into that, I need to build for you a case. I'm going to build for you a macro case, and then I'm going to build for you a micro case. And it's going to take some time, but we're going to really start to pick out some themes in the Torah. So in order to do this, I'm actually going to take us away from this week's parsha. We're going to come back in about 20 minutes to this week's parsha. And for the last 20 minutes, we're going to have an analysis of what's going on in the parsha itself. But before we do that, I want to see some sort of echoes of what happened in this week's parsha elsewhere. Echoes that are going to be spookily reminiscent of the parsha. Echoes of treachery. Echoes of brotherly breakdown. Echoes that actually sort of are the hallmark of what happens in the entire rest of the Genesis story. And then we're going to see that with greater power now, what's going on in the story in this week's parsha. So here we go. We're moving now on to the Joseph story. The Joseph story is amazing, not only because Andrew Lloyd Webber decided to make a musical about it, and so it's sort of like sings in your head every time you go through those parts of the Torah. I don't know if like you, but like I always get little sort of, what's he, Donny Osmond, right? You always got Donny Osmond sort of running around shul singing the songs as we go through those parts of the Torah. But in addition to that, and then we had it was great because last year we were in Barnet. I was in Barnet, and Mark Krieger put on a multicolored coat when he was doing the Musa Famida repetition and sang the songs of Joseph, which was great. And the Joseph saga is not just an interesting saga because of that, but it's an interesting saga because the story is rich. It's so rich, and as we go through Chasing Lullabies for this session, we're gonna see so much coming out of that story. But there's an interesting sort of break in that story. The story sort of follows a predictable pattern, and we know everything that happens within it. If you were to sort of play out the musical or the storyline of the musical, you'd be all right to read through the Torah and everything would seem familiar, except there's one chapter which is thrust into the Joseph narrative. One chapter which is put in there which doesn't seem to really have anything to do with anything around it, and it's there. Does anyone recall what that chapter is? There's just one chapter in the Joseph narrative that doesn't seem to fit.
It's not Judah and Tamar.
Right.
Great,
yes.
Joe. Thank you very much. It is Judah and Tamar. So thrust into the middle of the Joseph narrative, after they've sold Joseph into slavery, is the story of Judah and Tamar. A quick recap in 30 seconds. Judah moves away from the rest of the brothers. Judah has a couple of sons. One's called which means wickedness backwards, right? Ra. And the other one's called Onan, which means mourning. Okay, marries a beautiful lady called Tamar. Is not willing for her to become impregnated, and so because of his wickedness in that, he dies. His brother Onan, again literally mourning, he goes and performs Yibum with Tamar. Yibum, which we've already talked about earlier on, seeing some echoes already, when Abraham, in an act of loyalty to his dead brother, marries his brother's daughter Yiska, known as Sarai or Sarah. So Onan, in an act seemingly of loyalty to his dead brother marries Tamar, but again is unwilling to impregnate her, is unwilling to actually have a child with her, and so that loyalty to his brother's legacy is taken away. So Judah has now lost two sons to this lady Tamar, and he is not willing to give his third son, Shelah, to her as a wife. She takes matters into her own hands, dresses up as a disguises herself, dresses up as a prostitute on the path in order to seduce her father-in-law Judah, so that he should be the one to carry on the legacy of her original husband. He should be the one to perform Yibum, and so he is seduced. He doesn't have payment for her. Her payment is a goat, but he doesn't have payment, so he offers collateral in the form of a coat, a staff, and a signet ring. It turns out that she gets impregnated through this act, and the townspeople are aghast at the scandal that the lady who is waiting for Yibum and is meant to be waiting for Shelah, the third son, is now somehow impregnated. How on earth did that happen? So she gets taken out to be burnt, and she calls up and asks her father-in-law, or asks anyone, can anyone recognize these signs? And Judah says, Sadka Mimeni, she's more righteous than me, and as a result of her being more righteous than me, so he admits to what happened, and the rest is history. That from her and him comes the Davidic lineage. Fine, that's the story. What on earth does that have to do with the Joseph narrative? So much so, Andrew Lloyd Webber had no place for that in his musical. I mean, he's also quite happy with scandals in his musical, because in the musical that I performed in City, which was JC's Superstar, quite ironically, he was very happy for all sorts of scandals in terms of JC and Mary, or Jay and Mary, to be talking about. But he didn't put this into the musical. It didn't seem to fit to make the cut. So what's going on? So I want to show you some slides. Okay. I want to tell you a story. Okay. Here's the story. Can you see my screen? Yeah, great. So once upon a time, in a story involving coats, so Judah gave his coat as a collateral payment to Tamar for her services rendered. This coat was later given to Judah to identify, using the language haker na, please identify, please recognize. So once upon a time, in a story involving coats and goats, let me just tell you the story, and then I'll break it up. Once upon a time, in a story involving coats and goats, there lived people who were enduring an unending mourning for a person who was not quite dead. I'm reading the grey part. And a man who lost 2 children, owing to a failure in loyalty of one son to another, who was desperately trying to hold on to his 3rd son, even though this would end the cycle. And I could add in over here, and then a masked stranger took actions into their own hands. So let's now flesh that out. Once upon a time, in a story involving coats, so Judah gave his coat as a collateral payment to Tamar for her services rendered, and this coat was later given to Yehuda, to Judah to identify. Please recognize Hakerna, using that language, and a goat. There was a goat. A goat was Tamar's fee, for which Judah offered his coat as a collateral. There lived people who were enduring an unending mourning for a person who was not quite dead. Tamar mourned for a husband, literally backwards, not fully dead. He's not fully dead because his legacy had the potential to live on through Yibum by Tamar having a child with a surviving relative. And there's a man who's lost 2 children. Judah has lost the first son, and then Onan, the second son, when they died following their relationship with Tamar. And why has he lost 2 sons? Owing to a failure in loyalty of one son to another, because Onan should have completed Yibum to continue his brother's name, something he was unwilling to do. And this man who's lost 2 children was desperately trying to hold on to a 3rd son. Judah would not let Shelah marry Tamar, lest he lose another son, even though that would end the cycle, because if Shelah would marry Tamar, legacy would live on. Onan's legacy would live on. The whole thing would be brought to an end. But because Judah can't let go, so a masked stranger, which is Tamar, needs to take actions into her own hands. Where have we heard this before? Where have we heard this before? I'll tell you where we've heard this before. In the Joseph and Jacob story. Once upon a time, way back many centuries ago, not long after the Bible began, Jacob lived in the land of Canaan, and he gave a coat to his son. Once upon a time, in a story involving coats, Jacob gave Joseph the now famous coat. When Joseph's brothers sold him, they took the coat, dipped it in blood, and gave it to Jacob to identify, using 2 Hebrew words. What were the Hebrew words? Haker na. Please identify. There's only 2 places in the whole of the Torah that the words Haker na appear. Please identify. One is when Tamar holds out a coat and says, please identify it. It's from this person that I was impregnated. And the other time when the brothers take a coat that was dipped in blood and they hold it out to their father and say, please identify it. There's also a goat in the Jacob and Joseph story. What's the goat? Anyone?
Dipping the coat in the blood.
Dipping the coat in the blood. The brothers killed a goat to dip the coat in its blood. There lived people who were enduring an unending mourning for a person who's not quite dead. So when we were in primary school, every year they would teach us about Ron Arad. Do you remember Ron Arad? Ron Arad was the is the parachutist who parachuted out over enemy territory and was captured, and they never got the body back. I can't remember. Have they finally repatriated his body? They haven't. No. And his wife was always caught in a state of limbo, because when you don't have a body, you never know. You never ever know. Now Jacob has been told that his son, his beloved son, the son of his beloved wife, the firstborn son of his beloved wife Rachel, that Joseph has died. He's been told he's been killed by a wild animal. Tarov Toraf. He's surely been ripped to pieces. But he has no body. There's no body there. He's living in a state of unending mourning. Jacob mourned for Joseph, for whom there was no body or burial, leaving a crippling suspicion always lurking in his heart. Maybe he's still alive. In actual fact, Jacob becomes so depressed by this grief and this loss that he loses prophecy. It's not until he finds out that actually his son is alive that he, many, many years later, that God's prophecy returns to him. It's the depression and darkness, the blackness of absolute loss that sits with him for so many years. It's interesting, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they try and differentiate between normal grief and clinical depression. And the only difference in terms of its features is how long after the person has died the grief reaction continues. If the grief reaction continues beyond about 6 months, then they say that what looks like normal grief initially then can become a clinical depression. Jacob falls into a clinical depression essentially and loses the ability for prophecy. Prophecy can only happen in a state of simcha, in a state of deep joy. So there live people who are enduring an unending mourning for a person who's not quite dead, and a man who's lost 2 children. Who's this man who's lost 2 children? Well, Jacob's lost Joseph when he was sold, and he thought he's died. And then he lost Simeon, when he was imprisoned in Egypt. Because what happened in Egypt? That when the brothers first go down, so Joseph sees that these are his brothers, and he creates a plan. By the way, Joseph was the masked stranger, the disguised stranger. Tamar was this disguised stranger in the first track, in the Judah and Tamar track. The disguised stranger in this track is Joseph himself. And I think the message from that is context is everything. The father-in-law doesn't expect to see his daughter-in-law dressed up as a harlot on the road. The brothers don't expect to see their brother as the viceroy of Egypt. Context is everything. So anyway, so Jacob lost Joseph when he was sold. He's lost 2 children. He lost Shimon when he was in prison in Egypt. And why has he lost these 2 children? Owing to a failure in loyalty of one son to another. Well, clearly Joseph was a lack of loyalty from one brother to another, because they wanted to get rid of him. But why was Shimon a lack of loyalty? Because Shimon, as the second oldest brother, should have supported the oldest brother, Reuben, who tried to protect Joseph from the anger of the other brothers. If you recall in the story, Reuben's not so happy. He runs away, he protests against the plot, and he runs away because he wants to go and get Joseph back later. He says, put him in the pit, and he'll come back later to get him. And in the meantime, who hatches a plan to sell Joseph instead? Who is the protagonist of the next layer of deception? It's Judah. So one second, now we're seeing a link between the 2 tracks. who brought it, who moved the story from the first track to the second track, or who is the person who spans the two? It's Judah. But anyway, Shimon should have been supporting the second oldest, should have been the second oldest in line, right? Reuben, Shimon. So Reuben wasn't happy. If Shimon also supported him, so then all the brothers would have folded. But Shimon doesn't. And so there's a lack of loyalty between the brothers. And this father was desperately trying to hold on to his third son, because Jacob would not let Benjamin go down to Egypt lest he lose another son. He's holding on to him. The masked stranger in Egypt, aka Joseph, has said, just bring down Benjamin and I'll let everyone go. Right? If Benjamin were to go, and even though it's like, if Benjamin were to go to Egypt, Joseph would reveal himself, Shimon would be released, and father Jacob would have all his sons back. He'd have everyone, but he can't let go. And so we asked, why does the story of Judah and Tamar sit in the middle of the Joseph saga? The reason it sits in the middle of the Joseph saga is because it's the tipping point. Because Judah, a man who has orchestrated this locked situation for his father, a man who has orchestrated the situation where his father would lose a son, and then another son, and then refuse to let go of his third son, is now put into exactly the same situation. And Judah realizes that what let him out of that situation, what gave him the escape, it was collateral. Offering collateral for a fee and recognizing the role he had to play. So Judah says to his father, he says, a man who's lost two sons and was unwilling to give up his third, looks to his father, a man who's lost two sons, and says, and is unwilling to give up a third. He says, I can see your deadlock. I can see you're locked into a situation here. I was also locked into a situation. It was a collateral that enabled me to get out of that situation. A collateral allowed me to own up to my own actions here, to my own need to get involved. I will now be collateral for your deadlock. I am responsible for your deadlock. I will be the collateral. If they want to take Benjamin, they won't take Benjamin. They'll take me instead. And so this is the tipping point of the Joseph saga, because this is when Judah stands up and says, I will learn from what happened to me and be your collateral. I will then allow this whole thing to untangle itself. Okay. Why did I share that with you right now? Other than that being a mind-blowing piece of connection, right? When you first learn that, for me, it took my breath away. To see those links, to see that the fine, nuanced connections between stories in the Torah that we never noticed before. That's amazing. But there's something else to notice, because there was a theme there. There was a theme of goats, a theme of coats, of brothers being loyal or disloyal to each other, brothers interested in the legacy of another brother or for taking away the legacy of another brother. Where else do we see a story of goats, a story of coats, a story of loyalty and traitor, and I don't know what the word is, and the opposite, and traitors? Where do we see that?
Oh, what Jacob and Esau?
Jacob and Esau. There's a goat. Daddy Isaac wants to eat a goat. There's a coat. Jacob gets dressed up in brother Esau's coat, and there's a lack of loyalty between one brother and another, as there's a deception afoot. It's almost like the Torah is telling us, you want to know where the entire possible downfall of the house of Jacob came from? It's from this act of disloyalty. The Torah is screaming out to us, something went wrong. Something went wrong. Goats and coats is not a happy motif in the slide we just shared. Goats and coats is a story of pain, of depression, of death, of stuckness, of people unwilling to let go, people who can't quite stand up for what they need to stand up for. If it wasn't for Judah, who broke that deadlock, Jacob would die a sad, sad man, a broken family, brothers ripped apart. If you want to know why goats and coats is used as the motif over there to connect the stories, it's because goats and coats started it all in our parasha this week. So we spent about 20 minutes going through the building, the externality, let's dive into this parsha. And I just want to kind of put aside one possible defense for Rebecca, because it was mentioned that there was a prophecy. There's a prophecy for Rebecca that she has to rely on. The prophecy said, Shnei goyim bevitnech, there are two nations in your womb. Shnei lu'umim mime'ayich yiparedu, and two nations shall come out from you. Ula'oim mil'oim ya'amotz, one people shall struggle with the other. V'rav ya'avod sa'ir, and the greater shall serve the younger. She's got a prophecy on her to support her. Maybe we could, Rivka's back in the studio, Rebecca's back in the studio. She say, look, guys, case closed. I don't need to talk to my husband. I don't need to care about Esau's feelings. I've got God on my side. God said this is what's going to happen. Let's just leave it at that. Marriage communication, very nice. For you people who want to have a nice marriage, very nice. I just want to deal with what's God's, I'm just interested in what God has to say. He said, this is what's going to happen. I made it happen. Case closed. Why is that not a good defense? I would open this one up, but I just want to cover quite a bit of material. So I'll tell you why it's not a good defense. Let's imagine that we are now not sitting here in Barnet, but we are in the United States of America, and we've been intensely involved in the recent presidential election. Actually, let's not imagine that too much because that's just too depressing. But let's imagine that we were, and that we were a campaign manager for Donald Trump in one of the key swing states that he needed to win in order to get those holy 270 electoral college votes to get over the threshold. And we were the campaign manager in one of those states. We go to bed one evening and we have a very strange dream. We're actually visited by the Almighty. We're visited by God in that dream. And God says to us, he says, listen, guys, look, I know Donald's not great, but he's great for Israel. So we need him to win. He's on God's team this year. Ivanka and everyone, they're doing a good job. So I'm going to give you a check for $5.2 million. It's going to actually be under your pillow when you wake up. I want you to pour a ton of money into Donald in this state, because if he wins this state, he's going to win the election. Okay. So, by the way, this is not a personal opinion about the candidates. This is just a joke. This is just a thought experiment with a bit of drama thrown in. So you wake up and he sort of like blearily feels under the pillow in a half sort of morning stupor, and he feels a rustle under his hands. And he sees that there's a check for $5.2 million signed from the Bank of God. He doesn't know what to do with himself. He doesn't tell anybody. So in the morning, as soon as the bank opens, he runs to the bank, and the check clears. The check cashes. It hits the account. You've got God on your side. You've got a prophecy. And so he starts campaigning, or she starts campaigning as much as they can throughout the state, putting Donald out there, making parlor meetings, all the different propaganda tactics that they use. But a week before the election, get a phone call from your partner in the campaign, and they say, look, I know we've been putting so much effort into this, but it's not looking good. Actually, the latest polls suggest that we're 5 points down. But he says, but I know someone who works in the electoral office, in the vote counting office, and there's been quite a bit of talk of fraud recently, but there's someone who works in the electoral office, and I think that if you were to slip a bribe of, say, $5.2 million, they might shift it in Donald's favor. And all of a sudden, like a ray of lightning hitting your brain, you hear those words, $5.2 million. And you think, oh, I had a dream from God, and God gave me a check, and that check was for how much? $5.2 million. It must be that God wants me to bribe Bob. He wants me to bribe the electoral office. So why is that not a good argument? I will open it up. Why is that not a good argument?
It's wrong. It's morally wrong.
It's morally wrong. Absolutely. God's going to get you to go so far. God's going to get you to work hard, to campaign. But God's not asking you to break the law, to do illegal things, do things which are immoral. If really, God's a big boy. God, 5 points down in the polls, I don't know. I've done my job. I spent the money. I did the propaganda. The rest is up to you. You want Donald to win, you'll sort it out. Me, I'm not doing something which is immoral. You didn't ask me to do that. You asked me to campaign. You didn't ask me to cheat. 5.2 doesn't matter. You didn't ask me to cheat. So Rebecca, she's back here. Rebecca, look, you might have had a prophecy on your side, but actually, morality is important too. You're meant to be a matriarch of the Jewish people. You're meant to hold it to a moral standard. God gave you a prophecy, fine. That's God's issue, right? Jonathan, you already said that. Maybe you should just step back and do nothing. It's God's issue. God wants to give the blessings. God will find a way. God's a big boy. So let's work out what's going on. Let's jump into the parsha. There are 3 clues that will alert us to the possibility that actually Rebecca never wanted a deception to take place. And the first thing that we have to do, if we're going to read the text like this, is we have to not read with the end in mind. Sometimes we read a book, I don't know about you, sometimes I'll go to the end of the book, read the final few pages, work out where the story goes, and then with sort of a certain sense of security, you can read the rest of the book. No more problematic does that happen when it comes to the stories of the Torah. We already know the end. It's almost like the end colors the beginning. But if you are Rebecca living in that moment in time, that fateful moment when you hear your husband say to your firstborn son, at least genetically firstborn son, or not genetically, whatever, the first one that came out, you hear your husband say to Esau, you hear him say, I'm going to give you a blessing now, go and make some game. You don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know what's flying. You're responding to this situation right now. We don't know what's going to happen next. So if we now to get into Rebecca's mindset, we have to see how the text describes her conversations and her instructions at this point to see what she had in mind without knowing the end of the story. Because whilst we know the end of the story, she didn't. Okay, so we're going to have to go through three clues. The first clue, let's do a bit of a screen share. I'm just going to pull up Safaria. Okay. Sorry. First clue happens at the end of the story, where Rebecca says something which seems to be utterly strange. Just here we are. Sorry for the pull up Safaria. Let's hope that works. It didn't work last week, but it's working this week. So we're going to put up the chapter that we're dealing with. And I love Safaria. So you go to Tanakh, Genesis, and we're chapter 27, and we want to be in verse 45. But Rebecca says something to her son at the end of this whole deception. And I just want to see what you find strange about this. She says, Ad shuv af achicha mimecha. So he says, go to Laban, my brother's house, until your brother's anger against you subsides. Stay with him there. V'shachach es asher asisa lo. And he forgets what you've done to him. What you've done to him, you horrible boy. V'shalachti u'lekachticha l'misham. So then I'll fetch you from there. That's what she says. She says, let me not lose you both in one day. What do you find perplexing about that verse? What she says to her boy, Jacob.
She was the one that commanded Jacob to do all this. Right. She was responsible.
What did she? Absolutely, Jonathan. So she says, look, go over there until your brother forgets the awful things that you've done to him. You, Jacob, you Jacob. What do you mean, you Jacob? Who was the one doing the deception? Like, who was the mastermind of all this? Didn't we think that the mastermind of all this was you? Shouldn't it be? And he forgets what I caused you to do to him? Because Rebecca, weren't you the mastermind of this? So the first clue seems to be that Rebecca doesn't think that she's part of the deception plot. However, she's still the one in verse 8 insisting that something happens. So now we're going to move right to the beginning of the story. And now my son, Shema Bekoli, listen to my voice. that which I command you to do today. Surely sounds like she is the agent of this plot. And at the end, she's not taking responsibility for it. So clue number one seems to be that Rebecca has a different perception of the story, of what happened, than how we have perceived the story. The next clue carries on. She gives him the instructions, go to the flock and fetch me 2 choice goats, and I'll make of them a dish for your father, such as he likes. Then take it to your father to eat, in order that he may bless you before he dies. Jacob answers his mother Rebecca. He says, but my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am smooth-skinned. Maybe if my father touches me, I'll appear to him as a trickster and bring upon myself a blessing, not a curse. But his mother said to him, listen to this. This is clue number 2. I like him, your curse, it's going to be on me. I'll take it. Just listen to what I'm telling you and go and take what I've told you. You want to know where the curse is going to be? The curse is on me. Now, Rebecca, if you know that you're deceiving your husband, would you offer to take a significant curse, a curse from the holiest man in the world, the patriarch, right? The greatest, holiest man in this world? You're willing to take a curse from this man. Why would you be willing to say that? Why would you say the curse will be on me? Clearly, not necessarily clearly, but it seems like she's actually saying, it's not going to be a problem. She's offering reassurance. Jacob seems to be anxious. Jacob says, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know what's going to happen. And Rachel says, look, and Rebecca says, it's okay. You're worried? Don't worry. Don't worry, it'll be a curse on me. But she's not really meaning that. She doesn't really think there's going to be a curse, because she doesn't really think that there's going to be a problem here. Meaning she doesn't think there's a deception. That's clue number 2. And clue number 3 is in the previous verse, in what Jacob himself is saying. He says, Ulai Yemusheni, maybe he'll touch me, Avi, my dad will touch me. Vayisi ve'enov, and I'll be in his eyes. Look at this word here. Kim so te'ah, like a trickster. If you were to write this, how would you write it? I'll be in his eyes like a trickster, says the verse. How would you have written it if we think that it's all about deception?
Take the front letter away.
I take the Kim, right. I'm not like a trickster. I am a trickster. Jacob doesn't seem to think that he's actually going to be a trickster. Jacob seems to be saying instead that he'll be like a trickster. And what does his mother do instead in order to bolster his nerves? She says, okay, so you put on your brother's coat. You'll put on your brother's coat. And that will bolster your confidence. What are we trying to say over here? What's the theory? The theory is like this. There's a tension in the matriarchs and the patriarchs. There's a tension between Isaac and Rebecca regarding their son, Jacob. We see their tension go all the way back to when they are first named. Just going to give you one more screen share. We're now back in Genesis 25, at the very beginning of this story, verses 25 and 26, where there is the naming of Esau and Jacob. Vayetze harishon admoni. The first one came out red. Kulo ka'aderes se'ar, like a hairy redness all over him. Vayikru'u shemai Esav. And they called his name Esav, the one who is made, the one who is done, the one who is a doer. Vayikru'u, and they called. Who called? Who's they? His parents. Both his father and his mother, both Rebecca and Isaac. And afterwards, Yatza Achiv, comes out his brother, V'yadoi ochezes ba'akev Esav, and his hand is holding on to the ankle of Esav. Vayikra Shmoi Yaakov, and he called his name Jacob. Who called? It's not Vayikra'u and they called, it's Vayikra, he called. There's only one person doing the calling now. There's only one person giving the name Jacob. It's the father, not the mother. The mother is interestingly silent. While she was happy to name her first son Esau in an act of partnership with her husband, she remained silent in an act of protest against the name that her husband would give. She's not happy with Jacob being Jacob. What's Jacob? Jacob means ankle, but it also means that part of the body that is crooked. It's bent. In actual fact, when Esau refers to what Jacob did, he says, he's Jacob me twice. To Jacob someone is to be crooked with them. Right? Nowadays, we just say you Jew someone. But to Jacob someone, he Jacobed me, is to be crooked with me. Rebecca is not willing to name her son that. She recognizes that Jacob can also have the qualities of a doer, of an Esau, of someone who can stand up and not be crooked. Somehow the muteness, the lack of giving that name is a small testament to the love that she will later deliver to him, because she believes that he can become great, and actually he can become greater. How does she know that? She's got God who's told her that. God who's told her that he doesn't have to be limited by this holding on. It might be a weakness. It might be something you have to outgrow, something you have to learn about and overcome, but not something that is going to be inherently limiting. So she says to her son, listen, go, take some food, stand in front of your father and talk to him. Tell your father that you, Jacob, don't have to be just a Jacob. I've known that about you from when you were very little, from when you were just born. Your father doesn't know that yet. Why don't you talk to him and tell him? You want to know why they can't have a conversation, Rivka to Isaac? It's because Rivka wants the protagonist. Rebecca wants her son to have that conversation. Who's the best person to prove the value of themselves? It's the person. It's very nice for a mother to say to her husband, you know, he's really all right. It's much better for the child. And he says, well, where is he? Where is he now? He's not a doer. He's not an Esau. No, it's better for the child to come and do that. So bring the child in. Let the child be a man. Stand up. So she says, go, get some food, and we're going to go and we're going to get you to talk to your father. But she falls foul of the very result that she wanted to achieve. Because he'll get the goats, but who's going to do the cooking? She'll do the cooking. Somewhat undermining how much of a doer he's going to be. He's worried. He says, maybe dad's going to see me like a trickster. Maybe dad's not going to be what he won't want to see me. So she dresses him in Esau's clothes to give him some confidence to his nerves. But what's that image of a mother dressing a son? That's not a powerful doer that Isaac seems to value. That's someone who is still just a bit Jacoby. So she's undermining the very message that she's trying for her to get her son to communicate. That's the flaw in the plan. The idea is good. She doesn't see this as her intention to deceive her husband. On the contrary, she wants to empower her son to stand up and take on the mantle that God has said he is the right one to bear. We don't have to read with the end in mind. And that's why, by the way, that's why she can say, let the curses come to me. Let the curses come to me. She doesn't think there's going to be any deception here. She thinks she's finally going to activate her son to be the man he needs to be. The problem is that she's undermined it. She's dressed him. She's cooked for him. She's coaxed him, coddled him into it. And eventually, Jacob stands up in front of his father Isaac, and Isaac says, Mi ata bani. Who are you, my son? Jacob just doesn't know. Jacob doesn't know. Who am I? Am I the confident doer? Maybe I'm just Jacob. And so he's not really sure who he is. Can he be Jacob with a new and renewed identity? No, and he falls out of his words. The words just seem to fall out of his mouth. He says, I am your son. I am your firstborn son, Esau. I am your firstborn son. And that's where the deception begins. It wasn't planned. The plan was to empower and activate this man to be the person that Isaac would recognize as the rightful bearer of the blessings. And the deception falls apart, or the deception wasn't intended at all. The deception pulls it all apart. You can imagine Rebecca's like standing outside and she overhears the conversation and she knocks her head into the wall. No, you weren't meant to say that. You're meant to say you're Jacob. You weren't meant to say that you were Esau. And so goats and coats is the unplanned deception that reverberates through the life of Jacob, haunting him until another man, his son as well, gets caught in that saga, until Judah finally is able to stand up and take responsibility for these goats and coats. Hello. The final thought before we bring items to a close and just open up for questions, thoughts, and reflections is that the truth is that Jacob himself goes through a journey, and we're going to track that journey because Jacob will ultimately go through his own transition as he takes on the name Yisrael. Also could be read as Yashar Kel, straight in front of God, no longer crooked, now straight. He's able to face up to the foibles of the past and own his contribution to it. Just as Judah himself, Judah later on will also take on that message and own up to the foibles of the past and go for that straight path. But in the meantime, the passage has been set for deception, for betrayal, and for goats and coats. Thank you very much, everyone, this evening for chasing away the lullabies. We asked really one fundamental question: what was going on for Rebecca? Why did she deceive her husband? Wasn't she meant to hold the family together? And the answers, both answers that we gave, really said that yes, she did want to hold the family together. That was her primary intention. Things just seemed to slip out of her fingers. Thank you so much. I'll see you again next week, please God, on Chasing Lullabies.